2025 is officially over, believe it or not, and it certainly was a year that happened in politics. And now that we're looking forward to the new year and an ever important midterm cycle with massive consequences for the future of the United States, I wanted to sort through some political predictions for what the biggest stories will be this year, an overview of sorts where we determine whether or not each topic will actually be influential or will just be a flop that we forget about by the first state primaries in March. So let's begin. So I am recording this video the morning of January 3rd after the United States campaign to capture and remove Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro occurred late last night. And let's just cut right to the chase. This is going to be a huge influence on the political discourse in America this year. Obviously. Just this morning, Donald Trump said that the United States plans to occupy Venezuela until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. And Marco Rubio has already hinted that the American military is planning some sort of operation in Cuba as well. Quote, "If I lived in Havana and I was in the government, I'd be concerned at least." It's important for me to be as clear as I can be here, so excuse me for a second while I lay some points out. First, the West does widely believe Maduro to be illegitimately elected to the office of the presidency. The European Parliament formally condemned Maduro's reign just under a year ago, and although the United Nations recognizes Maduro's administration as the legitimate legal representative of Venezuela, both the 2018 and 2024 presidential elections in the country had significant irregularities that signified an illegitimate election. Second, there is hardly any specific evidence that Maduro is directly responsible for any sort of drug trafficking into the United States, nor is prevention of drug trafficking a valid excuse for America's military operation in Venezuela. Venezuela isn't even listed as a cocaine-producing country in the DEA's own analysis published in March. Colombia and Peru are the main producing countries, while the Pacific coast is utilized as a main trafficking route, not the Caribbean. A quick note from the editor's booth. I did say that cocaine isn't trafficked through the Caribbean. It's primarily trafficked through the Pacific coast. And that was a misnomer. I meant to refer to fentanyl and not cocaine, because fentanyl is the main excuse that the Trump administration has been using for invading Venezuela and capturing Maduro and bringing about the drug charges. And fentanyl is primarily trafficked into the United States through a variety of precursor chemicals that are assembled in the United States, but trafficked along the Pacific coast and through ports of entry in the Pacific or the southwestern border of the United States. And cocaine is trafficked somewhat through the Caribbean, although the majority of it is not. It's just one of the routes that's taken. But if the Trump administration wants to use fentanyl as an excuse for blowing up all the drug boats and capturing Maduro, then that's not accurate. And the DEA's own report claims that fentanyl is primarily trafficked through the Pacific coast. I said cocaine, I meant to say fentanyl. Anyway, back to the video. There's plenty of other channels out there covering the geopolitical aspect of this whole thing right now, but the main thing I want to briefly talk about is the domestic political discourse within the United States and how the invasion of Venezuela is likely to play out over the coming year. The main difference between this operation and the invasion of Iraq in 2003 is public perception of the presidency. Bush was incredibly popular after 9/11 as Americans rallied behind the government in the wake of a tragic event, with the subsequent invasion of Iraq boosting Bush's popularity even more. The country had been attacked, and the narrative held by most Americans was that Bush's actions and that of his military were intended to protect and defend the American people from a similar attack in the future. Well, we all know how Iraq ended up playing out, with Bush's approval rating dropping to historic lows by the end of his second term. His administration's actions still had plenty of legitimacy in the eyes of the American people during his first term. Trump, on the other hand, is already an incredibly unpopular president, facing a growing sentiment that he is unable or unwilling to actually address the issues that normal Americans are facing, many of which we will talk about later in this video. The invasion of Venezuela, outside of the endless American quest for oil reserves and distractions from the files, is an incredibly confusing move considering the whole pro-peace president thing that Trump was adamant about during the 2024 election cycle. I can only imagine that this invasion and subsequent occupation of Venezuela will have dire effects on the Republicans going into the midterms. Iraq wasn't so long ago that Americans have completely forgotten about it, and this is bound to bring up memories of endless resources being poured into occupying a country for the sole purpose of lining the pockets of military-industrial companies and oil executives. All while the American people themselves are suffering under the weight of an economic system that can't help but extract labor and resources from them with no respite nor return. This will be huge in the discourse this year. 100%. My hot take is that Christian nationalism isn't actually going to be that big of an influence this year, and I have two reasons for that. First is that Christianity has already become incredibly integrated into the basic functioning of the Republican Party. And no, I don't just mean recently. I mean ever since the Southern Strategy was implemented by the party in the 1950s. And while Christian nationalism as a term has only been used for 20 years or so, the identity it describes has been present in American culture as far back as the 13 colonies. Most of the colonies required you to not just declare a Protestant faith to vote or hold office, but they also required you to pass religious tests which were meant to bar Catholics and religious dissenters from participating in government. And while the Founding Fathers obviously intended for the United States to be an explicitly secular country, these incorporations of Protestant Christianity into political identities remained as strong as ever in the South, which was one of the social factors contributing to the Civil War. After the Civil War, theological liberalism did take a stronger hold and fundamentalism died down, but this was only temporary. Phrases like "in God we trust" and the inclusion of "one nation under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance feel like they've been mainstays of civic life for as long as we can remember, but they were actually Christian nationalist slogans brought about during the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s. Eisenhower also helped introduce the idea that the Constitution itself was divinely inspired by specifically the Christian God, an idea that the Founding Fathers were vehemently opposed to. Later, in the late 1970s and into the 80s, Jerry Falwell's moral majority solidified the mass of Christians already against America's large societal changes into a political voting bloc, explicitly combining conservative activism with Christian spirituality. This is very similar to the late Peter Wagner's New Apostolic Reformation, which seeks to do the same in the modern day, combining that conservative political Christianity with the passionate Pentecostal side to create an even larger bloc of political activists. However, the NAR isn't the only faction jockeying for political power within the Christian sphere, and this is why I think Christian nationalism won't actually be as influential in the coming year as the headlines might make it out to be. Not only are there two major warring trains of thought within the movement, either arguing that America was always a Christian nation and we have to go back to reclaim it, or that America was never a Christian nation and must be reconstituted to become one, but there are also sub-factions of relatively equal influence whose infighting will likely jeopardize the success of the broader movement. The NAR, made up primarily of charismatic dominionists, has competition with Calvinist nationalists who are notably much more racist and misogynistic than their dominionist counterparts. They believe in Reconstructionism, an ideology claiming that there is no neutral ground nor activity outside of God's rule. One is either following God in all aspects of life or not following God at all. This is a stark contrast from the NAR's broader cultural coalition, which seeks to influence not through one explicitly devout religious faith, but instead through a well-networked combination of many loosely related denominations. And I won't forget to mention the Catholic integralists either, who are working within the Catholic Church to dismantle the ideals settled on in Vatican II, which they believe to be inherently destructive for society in the broadest sense. Vatican II's reforms, for reference, included opening Mass from Latin to common vernacular, encouraging open dialogue with other faiths, fostering active participation by lay people, and more broadly encouraging people to develop a moral theology with their conscience centralized rather than objective interpretations of religious law and texts. The Catholic integralists believe that these reforms must be undone in order to save Western society from the corruption these more global theological ideas represent to them. Two of these movements rely on a smaller group of incredibly devout followers to infiltrate the government and exact monumental change before the broader public has a chance chance to respond. The larger movement, the NAR, relies on a much broader coalition of cultural influence to slowly move the public towards voting for their candidates and in favor of their legislative ideas. This is why the NAR chose Trump, a blatant non-Christian, as their figurehead. He is the leader that is most able to effectively incorporate all of the movement's conflicting political ideas into one big tent nationalist ideology. This also means that as Trump's popularity declines and he leaves office in 2029, and as the more extreme conservative Christian movements gain notoriety and lose public support, the NAR's image continually changes from one of religious unity to one of ideological chaos. And this is evidenced by the recent Turning Point USA conference in Arizona, where the primary topic of discussion was not the developing of a strategy to thwart the Democratic Party's surging polling numbers heading into the midterms, but instead the condemnation of fellow Republicans and debates on who should be included in or excluded from the Christian conservative movement. The NAR already lost its largest modern organizer in Charlie Kirk, is soon to lose another in Donald Trump, and is surrounded on all sides by democratic socialists, centrist establishment politicians, and ultra-conservative nationalists. It's not looking bright for the Christian nationalist movement, so I'm predicting it to have a 60% score in terms of its influence in 2026. It'll be influential in the same way it has been since 9/11, but likely not any more so. Speaking of that recent Turning Point USA conference, I think party infighting is going to be incredibly significant this year and may very well be the singular defining story of the midterms come November. The Republican Party is already showing signs of a damaged coalition jockeying for power within multiple simultaneous power vacuums. Polling by the Manhattan Institute earlier last month showed that there already exists a great uncertainty regarding the stability of the new Republican coalition, as newer and younger Republican voters are more conspiratorial, more supportive of political violence and rapid systemic change, and overall are more reactionary and extreme than the current establishment GOP. And this extreme fervor comes at a cost to the Republican Party, since these new entrants to the coalition are also less loyal to the Republican Party significantly, with 10% of under 50 Republicans saying that they'd be willing to vote for a Democrat, and 40% saying they wouldn't even be a sure vote for the GOP in any given House race. The divides within the Republican Party don't just stop there. Looking back at that Turning Point USA conference, there were multiple instances of clear disagreements and fights between commentators, most notably between Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson, who battled in their speeches over whether or not Nick Fuentes and similar white supremacists should be platformed, if cancel culture is infiltrating the party, and what strand of political ideology should be the main focus of the GOP come 2028. Megyn Kelly dropped Ben Shapiro as a friend after the event. Erica Kirk clearly stated that the party was in disunity, and Vivek Ramaswamy attacked the new nationalist wing led by Fuentes. Needless to say, there is severe dysfunction within the party's most popular social movements. I did say earlier that this would probably become the singular defining story of the midterms, though, not the primaries, and that's because in 2022's primaries, the last midterm cycle, 70% of Republican primary voters were over 50, and in 2024, the over 50s made up 60% of the primary electorate. Primary electorates are comprised mostly of stable voters with clear partisan preferences, which does not remotely describe the new entrants into the Republican electorate, who are much less likely to engage with the primary process in the first place. I think this infighting will only be at the backdrop of more pressing issues for the GOP as it marches through primary season, since the primaries are mostly decided by voters who are much less likely to care about the opinions of a group of influencers gathering in Phoenix, Arizona. However, come election season, when turning out the broader Republican coalition will be necessary to beat a very likely Democratic wave in the midterms, this party infighting will in all likelihood become the most influential topic in politics, as the politicians decided on in the primaries will have to convince younger, more volatile voters to turn out for them. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party has some of its own conflicts that it'll continue hashing out during the primaries. Mainly, is the future of the Democratic Party one of more significantly progressive values, or one that tries to maintain the status quo and convince the party's base that the system we have works just fine, as the Democrats have tried and failed to do in multiple recent election cycles? Later last year, elections swung towards the progressive wing, since the Democratic electorate is growing more and more tired of what it views as a stale brand of political thinking that has consistently lost them ground nationwide since 2016. Not to mention the latest fraud scandals that have have plagued Minnesota, even though there's a high likelihood that the inciting evidence for those scandals was faked or severely misinterpreted. All that most Americans are hearing through headlines and paraphrased discussions is that progressive policies for childcare funding have been exploited and taken advantage of. Try to convince New Yorkers that city-owned grocery stores aren't going to be cesspools of fraud now. And just to be clear, I am on the progressive side of things. I am a socialist through and through and believe these policies to be complete net positives. The data shows that they are too. There just are going to be renewed battles within the Democratic Party due to these scandals, and that will be a major story throughout the next year. Who are the Democrats? What do they stand for? Are they actually going to do anything at all? Cory Booker got close by holding up Congress for 25 hours earlier last year, but I don't know if I speak for anyone else here when I say that I don't remember a lick of what he said. Maybe it's time to push on to a new era in the party for the sake of America. I'm not a Democrat though, I'm just looking in from the outside. Anyways, there's a 90% chance that party infighting will be an influence in 2026. A report by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs late last year found that not only do large majorities of Democrats and independents support legal immigration into the United States, but so do almost half of Republicans. So it's needless to say that it's bound to be an incredibly unpopular thing when the government begins to routinely detain and attempt to deport large swaths of legal immigrants from the country under the guise of saving America from thugs and gang members. And that isn't even touching the fact that a vast majority of undocumented immigrants being detained and deported are foundational to our communities and our economy as a country. Also, American citizens per capita are far more likely to commit crimes than both documented and undocumented immigrants, and citizens are also incarcerated significantly more often than immigrants. I'm just laying all of this out there to show why the current administration's approach to solving immigration has been nothing short of a disaster in the public conscience. According to a Pew Research poll in December, a majority of Americans now say that the current administration is doing too much in regards to its deportation efforts, with 1 in 5 Republicans also holding that belief, up from around 1 in 10 back in March. Clearly, immigration is going to be a big deal next year, right? Well, honestly, I think this is sort of par for the course if you take into account how public opinion on immigration waxes and wanes depending on who's in office and what events happen each year. I also think both parties are probably going to attempt to pivot to other discussions for the midterms and leave immigration largely behind, as the loss of nationwide support for the Republicans' immigration policies doesn't necessarily mean that Democrats have gained any support, and this was one of their defining worst issues in 2024. Instead, I think the discussion is clearly going to revolve around affordability, because whether Trump likes it or not, and he famously does not, the American people seem to care a lot more about why their prices haven't decreased over the last year than they do about immigration policy. I give it a 50% chance of influencing the conversation. Like, maybe the Trump administration fucks up bad enough that they deport a US citizen celebrity and suddenly people get riled up about it again, but otherwise it's probably going to take a back seat in the political zeitgeist. The Files, which I will refer to as such to avoid the YouTube demonetization plague from trying to rip through my bank account, will either be the largest and most impactful story of the next year, or will be a complete nothing burger with no real influence outside of conspiratorial circles, just like it has been for the past however many years now. Granted, the Files have been a huge topic of discussion when it comes to people who don't know much about politics, but the discussion has always been vague and inconsequential. The main guy and his accomplice went to jail, and there's been a vested interest for DOJs in both parties' administrations to cover up any groundbreaking evidence that could incriminate people in power, and so far that's been about it. But now the current DOJ says it's combing through over 5 million documents relating to the main guy and his illicit activities, so I guess only time will tell. I think there's a larger consensus amongst political nerds that even if the Files reveal that the current president was clearly and indisputably up to some illegal activities with the main guy, it won't really matter much. But I don't necessarily think that's true. Obviously, Trump can't hold office for another term, so the thinking goes that since he doesn't need to convince Americans to vote for him again, the Files won't have any impact if they swing in the wrong direction. But how many people in his administration and in his movement more broadly would have to have been complicit in covering it up for years and years now, all while lying to the base, saying that there's big news that will incriminate the Democrats specifically? Good luck getting a political coalition to vote for your movement again after you convince them that the Democrats were the the only bad guys, and then it turns out that you were actually defending the real bad guys all along. There's only one thing that Republican voters hate more than Democrats, and it's pedophiles. And on the flip side, if none of this happens and no groundbreaking evidence is released out of these 5 million new files, we'll go on as we have been this whole time, with inklings of a suspicion that those in power were up to no good, but without the concrete facts to prove it. So either a 20% or 100% chance for this one, and it's a coin flip between the two. The files could bring down the entire MAGA movement and reveal wide-scale corruption unheard of since Nixon, or it could just be a minor topic of discussion that doesn't influence electoral politics in the slightest. For AI, it is going to be a rough year. Gallup has already shown that a vast majority of American adults, 80%, believe that the government should regulate AI regardless of how much that regulation would slow AI's growth. Recently, though, a Pew poll showed that less people think AI will have a positive impact on the United States over the next 20 years than people who approve of congressional Democrats. You can thank the recent Politico article for the growing hate towards AI for providing that fun comparison. It's becoming increasingly important for political messaging to be explicitly anti-AI. There are significant fears amongst the majority of Americans that AI will not just bring about job losses, but overt societal collapse as it decreases our trust in each other and makes possible a wide array of disinformation, not to mention its ability to allow one to detach completely from an already less connected post-pandemic society. If there was ever a certain topic for political discussion in a midterm cycle, it's this one. The debates around AI and how to regulate it also slot in nicely with the affordability argument that is becoming the go-to Democratic attack on the current administration, since the impacts of AI and an over-reliance on it as an economy could be severe depending on how much or how little the government decides to regulate it. Both political parties have also not yet completely solidified their arguments regarding AI, which means that we have to get ready for every local, state, and federal primary to be the testing ground for AI messaging in the coming months. It'll be pulled a ton. People will talk about it a ton, probably more so than they already are, especially as generative AI becomes more convincing and continues to dupe even the most tech-savvy people into believing it's real. What would be a catalyst that could cause rapid political change? Maybe political violence directly incited by an AI video, maybe an imminent attack being faked through AI audio of the president's voice and a hack into television broadcast. Who knows? Certainly, though, AI will be a massively influential topic of discussion in this midterm cycle, 100%. In the past decade or so, the Supreme Court has issued a plethora of decisions that have significantly narrowed the scope of what they consider to be corruption. To quote from the Yale Journal on Regulation, McDonnell 2016 confined official acts to concrete governmental decisions. Kelly 2020 refused to treat regulatory power as property. Ciminelli 2023 disregarded the right to control doctrine. Percocho 2023 rejected amorphous honest services duties for private citizens, and Snyder 2024 limited 18 U.S.C. Section 666 to bribes, not post hoc gratuities. The through line is clear. Criminal liability must rest on precise statutory language, lest vague standards erode fair notice, due process, and the separation of powers by letting prosecutors, not Congress, define crime. Not to be the legal eagle here, big fan by the way, but this basically sums up to mean that the Supreme Court has narrowed the scope of corruption to exactly what is in the text of laws, rather than letting the laws be opened up to broader interpretation. This significantly limits the efficacy of corruption laws, especially in a modern technological age where so many forms of corruption and payment can take place outside of the scope of the written word of the law. There's no consensus on whether or not corruption will actually significantly increase in the coming years, since political reform could sweep in and fix some of these problems relatively quickly with clear language that meets the arbitrary standards set by the Supreme Court. In the recent past, though, it has indeed been worse, due not only to the Supreme Court's rulings, but to general shifts in societal norms and a decreased interest in even punishing corruption in the first place. And unless you are, as Mother Jones puts it, caught in red-handed obvious favor trading, corrupt officials will be ensconced in safety with the knowledge that the U.S. Supreme Court is unlikely to allow prosecutors to do anything about it. The reason I put this on here is because there is a broader conversation that has been ongoing since Inauguration Day regarding the prices that large tech companies have been willing to pay in order to sway the president in favor of their interests. There are numerous examples of this during the Trump administration, with tech and legacy media CEOs acting like foreign dignitaries dignitaries providing gifts and lavishing praise onto the president so that he will look the other way and instruct his regulatory agencies, which he has influence over now, which is another social norm that's been deconstructed, to look the other way when they break laws on ethics and merge into monopolies. And with the already blatant partisanship of what were supposed to be nonpartisan government departments, like the DOJ's attempts at redacting the files, or the National Park Service blaming the radical left Democrats for shutting down national parks, it's becoming more and more obvious that the president is carrying influence into places that he normally wouldn't. Combine that with the weakening of corruption laws, an AI industry attempting to dissuade the federal government from enacting real regulations on its growth, and media companies attempting to merge into the largest monopolies imaginable, and you have yourself a great talking point connecting the current administration's policies to the enriching of the already rich, instead of improving the lives of common people. And it can all trace itself to a broader conversation about blatant corruption and the lack of punishment for engaging in it. However, I give this one an 80% chance of being influential this year, not a 100% chance. It's much more likely than not, but it could also be too complicated of an idea to be boiled down into headlines and easy talking points for politicians and pundits. And we know politicians love their talking points. And I give my channel a 100% chance of being the most influential YouTube channel in all of politics this year. That is a promise. I need to go to my job now. I had to rush recording this morning, but those are my predictions for the most biggest political stories this year. I'll review in the middle of the year and do another prediction set, and then we'll review at the end of the year. And we'll see if the things I predicted wouldn't be popular, become popular talking points, or the other way around. It'll be a whole thing. Anyway, thank you for watching. If you've been here this whole time, and I know a few of you have, I really appreciate your support. Took a little bit of a break because politics and news were becoming a drain on my soul, and it wasn't oh, I'm interested in studying what's going on. It was more just I can't get out of bed. So I'm back into feeling interested in studying it again, and have improved my life significantly since I departed. So all is good, and I'm excited to get back into the game. And there will be a video next week on QAnon. That's exciting because where did they go? That's what the video is about. Anyway, see you in the next one.